Caught in the crossfire. Caught in the...
What's up, guys? Lance, the Obscure Movie Guy, coming to you once again with another fun-filled, fact-filled video that you probably won't care about, but we're going to do it anyways, trying to change the world one post at a time. And today I'm coming at you with another horror anthology from our good friends over at Herman Productions. Yes, Phil Herman and his team are at it again with another horror anthology that we're going to be talking about. So let's dive into the video and take a look at An Actor's Curse, A Tale of Twisted Fate. Now, if you guys have been following me, which you should, you might recognize the name Phil Herman. We've talked about a number of his films. Most recently, we went over Jacker 3, a sequel that's been 30 years in the making. We've also talked about a couple of his other horror anthologies, I Slay on Christmas and Phil Herman's Unearthed. And he is at it again with The Actor's Curse, A Tale of Twisted Fate. 4 short stories that revolve around a wraparound story of an actor that is writing in a book, and turns out that the stories in which he is writing come to life. And like most horror anthologies, especially with Phil Herman's horror anthologies, every short story is done by a different production team and a different director. But they are all familiar faces in which Phil Herman has worked with in the past. James Panetta, Will DeVokes, Derek Brash, and even a foreign film by Marcello Fambani. And if I'm saying that wrong, I'm sorry. But I know that Marcello has done a couple of other short stories in Phil Herman's horror anthology. So it's kind of cool that you have 4 stories. One of them is a bit of a foreign short story, a foreign film, if you will, which he's done in the past as well. So kind of a little bit of a mix-up, or I should say a shake-up in the storytelling, which is kind of cool. Gives it a different take on storytelling. But as I said, the wraparound revolves around Joe DiBartolo's character, who gets a mysterious book after a knock on his door and starts writing down these stories in this book. And the stories come to life with deadly consequences. The first short story is directed by Derek Brash, called The Director's Demise. Basically tells the story of a no good director, no good in, not in the no good way of what he's making isn't good. He's just verbally abusive, belittles people, is very commanding, sexualizes the girls. I would imagine it's probably some relatable stuff that some actors do run into, and it's not anything that we haven't heard of from other big time actors in Hollywood having to deal with some directors that are overbearing and often sexualize and sexploit the women in some cases. In this case, the director doesn't come out on top. The second short story, The Producer's Plight, done by James Panetta, is a bit of a similar tale, but from a producer standpoint, trying to fund a movie rather than make a movie. So in order to get these funds, we have to do some things that we don't necessarily want to, or things that are a necessary evil, if you will. The third story is The Writer's Woe, done by Marcello Fambani, and tells the story of a writer trying to write a vampire book in Latin America, and comes across a book, I guess, that he's trying to transcribe. But it turns out that the book itself that he's transcribing is a very real book, a very documentary style book, if you will, nonfiction. Tells the tale of vampires in the area, and once again with deadly consequences. And the fourth story is done by Will DeVokes. The makeup artist's misfortune tells the tale of an actor who has his face scarred from bad makeup and prosthetics, and ultimately tries to take his revenge out on the makeup artist that scarred him for life. Once again, a very relatable story, I would imagine. I'm not an actor. I haven't had any of these things happen to me, but I will say that each and every one of these stories, I feel like is relatable in some terms. Maybe not the deadly consequences in which they entail, but I do feel like as an actor, you've probably run into an overbearing director or a producer that has to do maybe some not so great things in order to fund a film, or the producer themselves is fronting the money, and you're not always 100% where that money's coming from. The writer's woe, I imagine that most people that have written and directed their own films have run into writer's block, as they say, and you're trying to meet a deadline to get a book or a script out. And then obviously from a makeup artist standpoint, I don't think anybody that's a makeup artist tries to go in with the intent of scarring somebody for life, but sometimes chemicals don't mix well with certain people's skin, or maybe certain oils or something like that. I'm sure there's many stories out there. So the cool thing with this horror anthology is that the stories, despite the deadly consequences in which they enthrall, they are relatable, especially if you are an actor. You've probably seen or run into some of these things. So that's kind of a cool take. And obviously, that goes with the name The Actor's Curse, A Tale of Twisted Fate. It's from an actor's point of view. Joe DiBartolo portraying this actor that has seen these atrocities play out in his career. And much like the last anthology that I reviewed for Phil Herman, which was Phil Herman's Unearthed, I don't really have a whole lot of negative things to say about this horror anthology. It actually turned out really well. The production quality is pretty top notch. The stories are engaging. The acting is very well done. Um, the writing is really good. And I find it impressive that Phil Herman's able to put together a team of this caliber, that's able to put together stories that also, they don't just correlate with the wraparound story, but they do kind of correlate with each other because they are all done in a very similar fashion. The only negative things I would say is I probably would have mixed up the order a little bit. I probably would have done Producer's Plight as last, and probably bumped up the makeup artist's misfortune to the second story, because when you're watching it, the first two stories are very similar, not only in the story itself, but they're also shot very similarly. So doing them back to back didn't really, they didn't really seem that much different from each other. So I probably would have played with the order of the stories a little bit, but not necessarily how they were executed, because they were all really well done. The only other thing that I maybe had a little bit of an issue with was the foreign film, The Writer's Woe. It does run relatively long for a writer's story, and the pacing on it is also a little bit slow. So I wouldn't necessarily change the arrangement of where it was in the running order. Um, but if they could have done a little bit different with the pacing, because it is a very detailed story, is probably the problem. It's very detailed. You have this writer in Latin America that's trying to do this research on the ground. He has to talk with his editor and agent back home, and there's a lot of back and forth on the phone. There's a lot of back and forth with the local folks, and it was a lot. It was a good story, but it was also heavily detailed, and that's why it ran so long, I felt. I wish they would have taken a little bit away from the writer's woe as far as the runtime, and possibly given a few more extra minutes to the actual wraparound story itself. Um, and I don't have any issues with the actual wraparound story. In fact, I talked with Phil about this when he first mentioned it, way back in pre-production. But the wraparound story does remind me of the anime Death Note. If nobody's familiar with Death Note, that's basically a book of death where if you write a name in the book, that person will die. And in Death Note, you can actually go as into detail as how they die, when they die, which is very similar to what you're seeing here. Now, maybe Joe DiBartolo's character wasn't going in with the intent of killing these people, which would be a big difference between, Actor's Curse and Death Note. But the story that in which he was writing came to life at the end. And much like Death Note, if you're writing in the book, you're also going to die yourself. So there was some similarities there. Phil didn't seem that concerned with it, and Phil's right about a lot of things. There's a million stories out there. Some of them are bound to cross contaminate one another every once in a while. You're bound to come across another storyline. But I do want to make it very clear, Phil Herman had no idea what Death Note was, so he's not ripping off this idea from the anime. It just happened to be something that he came up with, and it is similar to Death Note. So I want to make that very clear. He's not ripping anything off from these people. He came up with this idea, and it just happens to be kind of like Death Note, but in a entertainment industry type scenario, which was pretty cool. It was a really good wraparound story. I wish they would have expanded upon that a little bit more. And nothing against Marcelo's story. It was a little bit longer than some of the other ones, and the pacing was a little bit slower than the other ones. So you could have put it last, or you could have done the pacing a little bit differently to execute it quicker. All in all, if you're into horror anthologies, Phil Herman delivers again with another really good one to go watch. Pre-orders are available for the DVD and Blu-ray. You can go on Facebook, find An Actor's Curse, A Tale of Twisted Fate, and pre-order yours today. You can also check out Phil Herman's Facebook page and pre-order through him as well. I highly recommend it. It's a really good horror anthology. Each respective director and writer put together a solid story. There's a good wraparound story. It's well executed. It's well polished. The acting's pretty solid. The cinematography is really good in all respective stories. So I think overall they did a really, really good job with this. And horror anthologies, I mean, Phil Herman always seems to come up with a good one. So I'm looking forward to whatever his next horror anthology will be. I'm sure he'll come up with something. I know they were working on something that I don't want to give too much away. It's still in pre-production, but you can find out more through Phil Herman's Facebook page. So, and like I said, pre-orders are available for the physical media. I highly recommend getting physical media because streaming is not always the best answer to everything. So go check out An Actor's Curse, Tale of Twisted Fate. When it's available, go pre-order your physical copy. Like, subscribe, and comment to my YouTube channel. Check me out on Facebook and Instagram, and I'll see everybody in the next video.